Sounds good. I will let it in.
Awesome. Let's start video.
Dark secrets, darker lies, fading heartbeat, fading cries, started sinking like a stone, going down, not going home. The tide has turned, the waters rise, another day passes by. I could see them, my love. I could see them, my blood, rising through the flood. Glimpse of brightness, ray of light, rising up, ending night, never here, never gone. Hope returns when the dawn, the tide has turned, the waters rise, another day passes by. I could see them, my love. I could see them, my blood, rising through the flood. Brothers stand, sisters too. I am right here next to you. Won't give up, won't let go, as waters rise through the storm. Rising through the flood.
When your
Good afternoon, morning, wherever you guys are located. Welcome back to our Reclaiming Native Psychological Brilliance Echo series. My name is Bernice UP Jordan. I am a citizen of the Fort Peck Sioux Nation. I am one of the public health program managers here at USET. Next slide. So we are building a community. Please introduce yourself in the chat. Select everyone and let your fellow participants know your name, tribal nation affiliation, if applicable, job title, and organization. Everyone will be muted until the audience feedback portion of the hour. During that segment, use the raise my hand icon on Zoom, and the host will unmute you to offer your reflection. You will receive a link to the recording and presentation by the end of the week. Next slide. Just a couple continuing education informations. This activity is jointly provided by the United South and Eastern Tribes and CARDIA Services. CARDIA Services is approved as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the Montana Nurses Association, an accredited provider approver with distinction by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. This activity has been planned and implemented in accordance with the accreditation requirements and policies of the California Medical Association through the joint partnership of CARDIA and the United South and Eastern Tribes. CARDIA is accredited by the CMA to provide continuing medical education for physicians. CARDIA designates this live web-based training for a maximum of 1 AMA PRA Category 1 credit. Physicians should claim credit commensurate with the extent of their participation in this activity. Next slide. Completing this activity. Upon successful completion of this activity, 1 contact hour will be awarded. And at the end, we'll go ahead and send you a link, and you can go ahead and click that link and submit. Your certificate will be sent via email. If you have any questions about the CE activity, contact Michelle Dowtry at mdowtry@cardiaservices.org or 206-729-4775. Next slide. And disclosures. There are no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies for those individual with the ability to control the content of this activity. Next slide. And just to acknowledge what Indigenous land you are on, you can go ahead and type this email, or there's a QR code at the top as well that you can reflect on. Next slide. All right, so I want to introduce the next presentation. It'll be Escalation, De-escalation, and Native Implementations by Holly Echohawk, who is our Senior Behavioral Health Advisor in New England MHTTC, and also Jeff King, Professor, Psychology, Western Washington University. All right, Holly, it's all yours.
Hi there, everybody. I hope you can see me. I can't see myself. Oh, there I am. Hi there. Hi, everybody. And, thanks so much for putting your names and your background in the chat, because we really look at those. I really enjoy seeing where you all are from all around the country, and it's important. And we actually keep that. We look at that information later, so to help us refine the presentations that we do. So today we're going to talk about escalation and de-escalation and implications that has for Native people. And you all know me. I'm Holly Echohawk. I'm a member of the Pawnee Nation in Oklahoma. I live now in the Portland, Oregon metro area, and I think that's all I'll say for now. And I'm going to pass it over to Jeff, and then we'll start. So Jeff can introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I like to think about what we're doing is not just for ourselves, but for our communities, for our families, for our children. And I'm a tribally enrolled member of Muskogee Creek Nation, and I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist, and I've been working in Indian country for over 30 years. So thanks for having me here.
Terrific. So the next slide. I wanted to mention too that every song and every video, every spoken word that we use at the beginning, we always start with one at the beginning and one at the end. They're intentional. We look for spoken word and songs and dance that reflect the content. The reason we selected the song at the beginning, if you were on, and we always start 5 minutes before the top of the hour. So that's when we start the first video. But it had lyrics in it about dark secrets. You heard him say sinking like a stone, water rising, rising through the flood, and hope returns. We thought that those lyrics really reflect the way people feel when they are emotionally escalate and then hopefully de-escalate. So the learning objectives, you can see them for yourself. We always include increasing knowledge in native brilliance, and today, coping experiences, coping ability that native people have. We're going to talk about behavioral escalation and de-escalation. We're going to talk a little bit about the implications part, which is there is obviously a link between native crisis and overrepresentation in criminal justice and child welfare systems. We're going to just briefly touch on, for a second, on motivational interviewing and how it can be helpful in de-escalation. And then we're going to show you a couple of slides. We're not really going to talk about it, but we want to share some funding information on crisis response with you. So the next slide. So just as a reminder, anybody, any population, anyone in the world, community crisis, whether it's local or wherever it is in the world, and now we know in the Middle East, we're all concerned about the people over there that are in the middle of a war. Any crisis can overwhelm the coping mechanisms of an individual or a group. In the next slide, but we always want to remind you that Native people have tons of resilience. We have the capacity to recover from difficulties, capacity to recover from challenges, from tragedies. We do that in a lot of different ways. We have our families, we have our land from which we get our strengths. We have our ceremonies, our beliefs, and then the next slide. And of course, we have our young people. This is a young man who, I love the shirt he has on, Get Drugs Off Our Riz. And some beautiful young Yurok ladies in Northern California. So all of those are our motivation and keeps us resilient. So the next slide. I want to tell you a story about native brilliance and our native people's capacity to cope. So number one, we are all innately brilliant. You all have heard me say this 1,000 times, I hope, and y'all probably say it 10,000 times more. Native people are brilliant. We're born brilliant. It's in our genetic DNA. But sometimes we forget that we're brilliant. Sometimes because of trauma experiences, unresolved trauma in particular, those unfortunate life experiences can really weigh us down. So I want to share a story that my buddy Terry Cross, the founder of the National Indian Child Welfare Association, told in a training that he was doing. I thought it was really brilliant. And he talked about, he used the analogy of a quiver of arrows. And he talked about historically, Native people have had many different ways to cope, many different tools that they use, many ways that they, either by action or by thinking, conversations, council meetings, whatever it might be, in ancient times to today, we have many, many ways to cope. And he used the analogy of a quiver of arrows, that all of us have like an invisible quiver of arrows on our back. And each arrow in that quiver is an example of ways we can cope. Unfortunately, a lot of people become so overwhelmed by their situation, sometimes very traumatic. Sometimes they have witnessed trauma. They might have been a victim of trauma. They may have suffered a really tragic loss from death or a loss of a relationship, and it overwhelms their capacity to cope, and they forget they have the quiver of arrows on their back. They could reach back and pull out an arrow of resilience and find their way again, but they forget, which is understandable, given the duress some tribal people find themselves in. But it's a beautiful analogy, and I just wanted to share that with you, the story about the quiver of arrows. So with that, let's go on to the next. So what I'm going to share with you is some information from one of a great resource, which many of you are familiar with, called The Body Keeps the Score. And that particular book is really beyond fabulous in the information that it holds. And if you haven't had a chance to look at it, we've included it in the resource list at the end of this presentation, but hope you take a look at it. I believe that knowledge is power. I believe that Native people are brilliant, born brilliant, but often they lack the information to trigger that brilliance to help them survive. Instead of running for their life, we want them to not just survive, but to live a good life beyond trauma. But many times, at least in my experience in many decades, as Dr. King has in behavioral health, people are so overwhelmed, and they often don't have the full information about what actually happens when you experience significant trauma. So there's several things that happen. Most commonly studied is the psychological impact of trauma, and all of you on the call probably quite familiar with this. Many studies for many decades, if not more than 100 years of examination of the mental and emotional state that results from the psychological impact of trauma. What's more new, not more recent, much more recent science is physiological impact of trauma, the brain science. And I think that's the information that Native people who are running for their lives, who are trying to survive trauma, they lack that piece of information. They lack the information about the biology of the incredible things that we call human bodies. It's a miracle what our bodies can do and how complex our bodies are. But in a trauma experience, our alarm system in our brain, which might normally function incredibly well to keep us safe, it can get all messed up. It can get rewired. It can start going off in different, not normal times. When our brain alarm system becomes rewired because of trauma experiences, it releases stress hormones. It can change your brain. So trauma can change your brain functioning, that it no longer filters relevant and irrelevant information cleanly. It gets it all mixed up. So people's alarm system, hypervigilant, are going off at abnormal times. And so the Body Keeps a Score resource is really a wonderful, it's a great read. It's a long read, but it's fabulous because it really explains the physiological changes that happen when people are running for their life. And I think that's a piece of information that Native people are missing. And without that information about the brain function and your nervous system functions, they can more easily think it's all about me. I'm just not a great person. I'm not smart enough. I don't know how to deal with this. It's all the I don'ts. But with that information, it can tap into the natural intelligence that Native people have, and they can say, oh, it's not just me. I can figure out with help. I can fix this. I can rewire this. I no longer have to be hypervigilant of the time. So let's go on to the next slide. The other group that struggle and they suffer sometimes quietly until something happens are Native veterans, of which we are quite proud of. Bernice Jordan is a veteran. We love and have so much respect for our Native veterans across Indian country. One Native veteran said, though, however, they teach us how to fight and kill in war, but they don't teach us how to live after we get home. And I thought that was such a poignant phrase. I wanted to share it with you all. And when we get to the end of this presentation, we're going to tell you about next month's presentation, which is going to address the Native veterans, some of the struggles that Native veterans have. So we'll tell you about that more later. So the next slide. So that's all a long way of saying it's not an issue of being hot-tempered. That's what some people feel that they are, or that's what they get called, names like that. It's not that simple. It is all about trauma and the brain and your nervous system. So let's go to the next slide. So I want to, so let's talk a little bit about the auto nervous systems in our wonderful, fabulous human bodies. And I love the way some of our Southern California tribes say human instead of human with an H, it's with a Y. So in our human bodies, we also have, in addition to this incredible thing called our brain, we have this unbelievable nervous system. And there's two parts to the nervous system: the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So normally those two parts of your nervous system, the invisible nervous system in your body, those work in sync. They keep us in balance. The sympathetic part of our nervous system, it's like the accelerator, the gas pedal on your car. It triggers arousal and it's connected to emotions. You know, our incredible senses, we see something, it kind of goes through our brain. It might trigger an emotion. The emotion is connected to the sympathetic nervous system. And when that alarm happens, when you see something that startles you, that sympathetic nervous system kicks in. It moves blood to your muscles so you can, quick action, so you could run if you have to. It increases your heart rate, increases your blood pressure. That's sort of the fight and flight sector of your nervous system. Super healthy, keeps us safe, whether it was in ancient times, pre-contact, or today. If I'm walking in a dark garage at night to get my car, something startles me, my sympathetic nervous system's going to jump into place, move all of those pieces in my invisible pieces in my body, and keeps me safe. The other side, the other part, I should say, not side, of your nervous system is parasympathetic. That's, you can look at that more like your brake, like the brake in your car. That is self-preservation functions. The parasympathetic side of your nervous system really supports digestion, healing. It puts the brakes on arousal. It doesn't let all of the adrenaline, run through your body. It slows down your heart. It relaxes muscles. It brings your breathing to a normal level. And you can see that's when you rest. That's when our bodies rejuvenate. We need digestion. We need kind of quieter moments to heal. That's the parasympathetic side. So normally those two work in tandem. They help each other out. They keep us balanced. They keep us centered. But not always. When you're exposed to a lot of trauma, well, it can't even be a lot. It could be one major significant incident. But often with Native people and Native young people, in my experience, they're exposed to repeated trauma events, whether it's something that happened to them, something they witnessed, something they can't understand depending on their age. So they may live more on the sympathetic side, not on the healing, quiet, recovery side of your nervous system. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to tell you another story. So this is a story about how Native young people were misunderstood. Something that really makes me upset. I hate it when I can see that someone is assuming that Native young people person or a group of kids in front of them lack intelligence. Totally untrue. They're brilliant. Maybe they communicate differently, but they get judged often, and I hate it. And I often will step in. I'm sure you all do too. Like, no, that's not right. These are brilliant young guys, or these are a brilliant group of young women. Maybe they're quiet. Maybe they're thinking. Maybe they're thinking more than you're thinking. So don't assume that they lack intelligence. So Jane Middleton Moss, who many of you might know, who's fabulous, she developed the only Indigenous master's program in Indigenous trauma and resilience at the University of Toronto. And I was with a group of people and she was giving this talk, kind of informal talk, standing in the middle of the room. And she told this story about a young native guy that was in high school. He was sitting in the back of the room, and something happened in the classroom, and it was a big blow up. And the young person left, but it was a big ruckus. So afterwards, the teacher went into the break room, which, you know, everybody does, right? But when she went in there, she too was, her sympathetic nervous system was triggered. So she had adrenaline running through her. She goes into the break room with the other teachers and she says, man, you would not believe what happened. That kid went from 0 to 10 like that. So Jane Middleton Moss says the group to our group of people, us, she said, okay. She paused and she said, what's wrong with that story? So everybody was thinking, and she said, what's wrong with that story is people that are living in trauma, living on the sympathetic, hypervigilant side of their life, they're never at 0. They live at 6. They might live at 7. They're never at 0. So that young man didn't go from 0 to 10. That's a falsehood. He probably went from 6 or 7 to 10. So I just want to share that story with you to let you think about that, because you often hear that so-and-so went from 0 to 10. No, that's not accurate. That's not the reality of what that person is living like, what their experience was. We don't know exactly what, but that's just an example. So I just want to share that little story with you. So let's go on to the next slide. So 2 things now. Just a definition of escalation, behavior escalation, and behavior de-escalation. And you know, you all received copies of all these slides. So escalation is defined as different. It's a situation where different responses in a human being, they will occur in a sequential pattern, and it's successively increasingly severe or intense. And in an escalation, it usually, and you all have probably all experiences maybe in your personal life, maybe in your neighborhood, maybe at the grocery store, and maybe in whatever work setting. But usually in escalation, it'll start with less severe behaviors. Somebody's upset, they're making faces, they're complaining, they're arguing maybe, and it escalates. it can escalate. Doesn't always have to escalate, but it can escalate where the sequential pattern, more and more severe responses, and it can end up in a physical assault that causes injury to someone, or somebody's car gets damaged, or somebody throws their phone, or, but you get what escalation is. The next slide is de-escalation.
Defined.
De-escalation, yes, defined. So de-escalation, it's whatever you do to try to interrupt that emotional chain of reactions that's getting more and more serious with each step. And it's also a way to establish a relationship with the person that's very agitated. And ultimately, it's to provide an opportunity to resettle that person so that they are back in control of their emotions. De-escalation. Crisis responders do that every day. That's what they're trained to do. So the next slide, I just wanted to show you a little graph. So on the left at the bottom, somebody's just calm, no incidents, just going about their life. Something happens, the trigger, they get agitated, they can escalate, they can peak, sometimes explosively, verbally throwing things, hopefully not, but sometimes hurting people, screaming, in the Super Bowl, right? That just happened. And the football player, Kels, or whatever his name is, I'm not a big football guy, in Kansas City. Remember that picture they showed of him just raging at his coach? They had that still photo of him, and they had videos of him, and his face was about this far from the coach's face. And I didn't see it, that he actually even pushed the coach and made him go off balance, but he was raging. That's an example of peak. Now, maybe that's unfair to use him as an example because it's a sports. I mean, their sympathetic side of them is like unleashed, right, in a game. But that's a visual is a good example of escalation at its peak. Someone who's totally out of control, raging, screaming, their face this far from another person's face, not having any effect, causing quite a scene, but they've lost control. They can't bring it back in. What they say, the toothpaste has left the tube. But ultimately, a physical body cannot sustain that forever. They start de-escalating. Maybe somebody's intervened. And in that football case, the other football players came over and got him. Remember that? So there's different ways that people can de-escalate by themselves of pure exhaustion or an intervention, but they de-escalate. The thing to pay attention to is that bottom, in the very bottom left where it says post-crisis depletion. Really pay attention to that when somebody has that unleashing of rage and adrenaline, because when they get to that point, they're exhausted. But more important to pay attention to, I think, is that they can be full of guilt. They can be dejected. They can be miserable. They can feel terrible about themselves. They're ashamed. That's a very vulnerable state for all the folks that work in behavioral health. And then they recover. So let's go to so now we're going to have the great treat of hearing some thoughts and commentary from Dr. King on what I've just said so far.
Thanks. Yeah. It's really helpful to have that kind of background to know that what I say is there's historical trauma and then there's local trauma. So by context, with the history of colonization, racism, inequality, the inability to access resources that tribes have experienced from the very beginning, it really creates an environment where the resources that should normally be available to you aren't available to you. You think about the boarding schools. children being taken away from their families, not being able to speak their language, not being able to practice their traditions, and so on. All of that is part of historical trauma, and it gets passed down through the generations, so that when I work with clients, I just assume that there's a background of historical trauma there. And then there's also local trauma, especially for a lot of tribes where there isn't access to these resources. And because of that, then people are living in the sympathetic nervous system. They are always on guard, always needing to protect. I was working with a client from Lummi the other day, and there were 2 suicides in the last 2 weeks. One a 70-year-old, one a 20-something-year-old. And when these things happen on a continual basis, I've seen this in tribes all over the country where these kinds of things happen. So what you essentially create in a social setting, because of historical trauma and the local trauma as a result, is that people are living in this sympathetic nervous system of always needing to be protecting themselves. And so, as Holly shared in that example from Jane Middleton Moss, people are existing at 5, 6, 7, and just trying to maintain, and it compromises people's ability to access the resources that they have within them, sort of in the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest. But when people feel safe, then they have access to their internal resources. When they don't feel safe, then they're always, their attention, their focus is just on protecting themselves, surviving, coping for the moment. And there isn't the energy, there isn't the focus to be able to draw from those internal resources that are there if they have a space where they can rest and digest and so on. And that has health implications as well. So in the sympathetic nervous system, your immune system is compromised, your cognitive abilities are compromised, you're more susceptible to getting sick and mental illness. Whereas in rest and digest, your immune system is actually being built up, and there's the ability to relate to others in a healthier manner because you're not about protecting yourself and so on. So this is all very, very powerful stuff and important to know. And as clients are informed with that, and they're able to get into that parasympathetic nervous system, it's amazing what kind of knowledge comes to them from within them. So this is very powerful stuff.
It's terrific. Thank you. Let's go on really quickly to our other slides because I can see I've been a little too long talking before. So we're going to go through these other slides really quickly so we can hear from Dr. King again. So this is my thinking. I think there's a lot of anger that simmers in Native people for lots of reasons. All the reasons you see on the screen, I'm not going to go through them. And that simmering anger, lack of resources or lack of ways to really address that can really create some challenges. So the next slide is one of the things that happens is when people escalate and can't control their emotion. Everyone escalates throughout a day, but you're in control. If you escalate, you're not in control. It can have deadly consequences. For example, in this, Native American people were more likely to be killed by law enforcement than any other racial or ethnic groups. Dr. King's saying that, much as we support Black Lives Matter, let's not forget that Native people are killed by law enforcement more than Black people.
And Holly, can I chime in just for a second?
Sure.
Just the fact that the Native people are an invisible culture, like there is Black Lives Matter and there's marches and so on, and rightfully so. But the fact that Native people are being killed by law enforcement more than anyone, and yet it's not seen, that in itself is a trauma to the community, is that this is happening and nobody sees it.
Exactly.
Just want to add that.
Sure. Thank you. And then the next slide is a couple of things about police. Police in general, law enforcement, they're all trained through the same source. Tribal police have an additional training at Bureau of Indian Affairs, but the traditional training was, the message was, make sure that you, meaning the police officer, and your partner go home safe tonight, which often meant guns drawn, right? The new training, which is totally different, is the new message is nobody's going to die tonight. Not law enforcement, not the civilian, not the person in distress. So it's a big shift. The next slide is Native people in criminal justice. And I just want to make the point that Native people are incarcerated at about 40% over the national average. So it's not always a good feeling to walk into a courtroom, fear and concern. The next slide is about Native people and child welfare. Many of you know this, you work in this field. Tribal people, children continue to enter child welfare system at higher, less than before because of great work at National Indian Child Welfare Association. Has been doing that for 40 years, fighting that fight, more than 40. But because of them and a lot of good people like you all, the number of tribal children in child welfare is less than it used to be, but it's still higher than non-Native children. And then the next slide is back to, so this is a so what question. So what about escalation, de-escalation? How does it fit into all of this? And would the ability to de-escalate prevent a crisis, a person in distress from spinning out of control and getting into the county jail, or hopefully not, but maybe a prison and all of that? Maybe, but maybe not, because it's not only your own personal behavior that gets, we have lived with racism every day. We live with discrimination. We live with misunderstandings, underestimating our value and our intelligence. But I do think that if Native people had more information on the neurobiology of the human body, it would be a great help. So I would encourage you all to think about that in your work and in your education and information you offer to the people that you work with. Because again, I think Native people are brilliant. They just need the information. And we're kind of often missing that piece of information. So the next slide is, we want it to go back to Dr. King, who is going to share a story with us.
Yeah, just a story to illustrate the point that the points that we've been making. I remember when I was working at one of the hospitals in the Southwest, there was a Native girl about 15, and she was on the medical side. We were on the behavioral side, but she was peaking, screaming, could not be controlled. There's sort of family history of trauma and violence and so on. And she was just, yeah, out of control. And so they called the behavioral health side. I happened to be the person to go over, and I walk in, and immediately I say, let's get outside this building. Let's go walk around the grounds if that's okay with you. And number one, I'm asking her for permission, letting it be her choice. And she was ready to get out of there because people were yelling at her and trying to control her, and not giving her much choice. So we went out and we walked around the hospital. I don't know how many times, but number one, I mean, she got out of the particular situation. Number two is we were able to get out in nature outside, and nature itself has its healing qualities that sort of stimulate that parasympathetic nervous system resting, because you're out in nature, there's room, there's space, and so on. So that's two. Number three is that we were side by side rather than face to face. Face to face could stimulate that fight flight. And then side by side is much more rest, digest. So, and then we were walking, and exercise in and of itself is producing, physiological responses in your body that allow you to relax. And she was able to vent. She was telling me her story from her point of view. So instead of being clamped down like you're the problem, what's wrong with you kind of a thing, and trying to control her, it was giving her choice, and it was allowing her to tell her story. And you could just see her just de-escalating, de-escalating, de-escalating. And so after a time of walking around the hospital, letting her tell her story and me validating her experience and so on, we were able to go back into the hospital and re-engage with her parents and the medical providers much more effectively. So that's kind of a story of this whole process playing itself out. So thanks.
That's a great example. I think I had mentioned before that I've heard some people talk about that as a walk and talk. It seems like a simple solution, but it's a way of helping someone de-escalate and getting them out of that environment, and for all the reasons that you just talked about. So that's a great example. So the next slide is just a word about motivational interviewing. And you all know, you all are probably very familiar with motivational interviewing. You probably practice it, probably have been trained in it, but it's really described as a way of being with people. I like the way that that sounds. And the principles of motivational interviewing, some of which I listed there, or the spirit, Dr. Kamala Venner refers to it as the spirit of motivational interviewing. It supports a calming atmosphere, and for all the different attributes of the way of being with people that motivational interviewing offers, can help decrease resistance from the person that's agitated or who has escalated, maybe getting closer to top of that peak. If you approach them with a motivational interview and approach, you're going to, it's not confrontational, it's the opposite almost. It'll help decrease their resistance. It'll give them the windows that they can see that there's a way to de-escalate. So just wanted to share that with you. The last thing we wanted to mention is the next slide. Is just to remember that quiver of arrows. Remember that we know how to take care of ourselves. We know how to address crisis, and often without any financial resources. We often turn to our ceremonies, the smell of our ceremonies and healing environments, and the unconditional support that is offered in those venues. We also always silently convey ways to be human, ways to be compassionate, ways to be caring. I just wanted to add that some tribes and tribal communities have developed community-wide responses to trauma. Crisis response, conventional crisis response is an individual focused process. And individuals in crisis team will come to respond. They're working specifically with that individual. Tribal communities is often more about mass trauma, which we talked about before. But so some communities have developed a community-wide trauma response, and it helps the communities feel much more in control. They have planning, they're pulling in all those arrows out in advance and developing a trauma response plan. So with that, we just want to thank you for listening to Dr. King and myself on escalation, de-escalation. Hope we gave you some food for thought, and we're going to turn it over to Olivia now.
Well, thank you so much. So much amazing information there. And I've heard some of it before, and I still learn new things and new ways of thinking about the de-escalation and listening to both of you. I love the whole image of the peak and looking at, what to do, to get folks really thinking about something different than the peak. So what we are doing in this part of our time together is really opening it up for reflections. Wanting to hear a little bit from you, just in what you heard or what you might have for questions, given the presentations from Dr. King and Holly Eckerhock. Now, Marie Erb, I saw that you're mentioning the opportunity in the recovery stage, coming off of the peak. And I really liked, what you had to say. And I'm wondering if you want to just talk a little bit more about that for a minute.
Sure. In my practice, I call myself a guerrilla social worker sometimes. Because I agree with life definitely isn't fair, and our systems are really messed up, and I try to normalize that rage that people are having. Yes, if I was in your situation, I would be really seriously angry too, and so I have made activists out of many of my clients. I can't count the number of times I've said, if you tell people that I told you how to do this, I'll deny it. Because the systems are in a lot of ways really messed up, and I think that people get diagnosed with all kinds of illnesses, whatever, for insurance purposes, but I think they're just having normal reactions to this abnormal society that we live in.
Yeah. Agreed. And it's also, that's why I also appreciated some of the kind of examples of how to de-escalate. And I see both Caitlin, that you're appreciating the school example. Kirsten, you're saying that loving the reminder that de-escalation does not start from zero. Yes, those are all really good reflections and points. Yeah, Dr. Brown, most of us are really at zero. Yes. Yes, I see, Anna, you have, you're talking about grandmother circle. And is there anything you want to say about that?
I heard the speaker say about how communities get together when trauma happens, and when we have to face these escalating things that happen in the community. This happened recently when somebody got shot when they were trying to put up a statue of Juan de Oñate here in Española, New Mexico, and a native gentleman got shot he's from the Northwest Pacific. So we had a grandmother circle arranged a ceremony for anybody who was there at that place who went. I don't know if I said this at last meeting. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but we arranged a ceremony for anybody who was there and experienced that trauma, and it was a beautiful ceremony. Sheesh, beautiful. There was like 40 people that came. So this is what the grandmothers do, and this is what the speaker said. You take out all your arrows and you get ready to confront what happened and to bring peace to the people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I appreciate you just taking the time and being willing to share. Please keep the comments coming if you'd like to. Love the idea of sharing, strategies that work with all of us that we can share back out. And I'll turn it back over to Holly. Oh, there is one question that just came in. Sorry. Jeff and Holly, there is a question. Have you worked in the space of support in schools?
I have not. I've not worked in schools.
And I worked in the Denver public schools, and the cool thing about what Denver did many years ago was create Native focused schools, because the Native community in Denver is so spread out. It's not like there's one neighborhood or one area where there's Native people. And so these kids were, there'd be maybe one Native kid or just one Native family in a school, and they didn't see anybody like themselves. So the focus schools allowed Native parents to send their children to specific elementary schools. There were 2 elementary, 1 middle, and 1 high school where Native kids could go, where other Native kids were. And then they also had focus school facilitators who were Native by and large. And so as they were getting their education, they also had contact with other kids that looked like themselves. And then a Native facilitator who could at times take what they're learning in school and tie it to Native traditions and so on. And what they found was that the attendance rates for Native children increased humongously. The amount of times that they were sick decreased incredibly, and their grades improved. And then I was there in the schools in general, but also to work with the Native kids. And so we were able to form groups and they could support one another. But the bottom line in that is that culture is strength. And if you can introduce it into the schools, then it was Denver Public School District. So I believe it's still going on. So it's been a while since I was there.
That's great. Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for listening to us, and we hope we stimulated some ideas. Thanks for latching on to the quiver of arrows analogy. I hope that stays with you for a long time. Thank you, Anna, in Mexico, for giving us that great example. We can feel the power and emotion in that. So we just want to show you, I'm not going to talk about this, but funding sources. The first ones are funding sources that SAMHSA has funded. They're not available now, but you might want to keep your eye on those. They might renew, so you can click on those links and it'll tell you about the past ones or the current ones, but that will kind of keep you in the loop if they renew it and put out requests for this spring. There is one that's open now, which is the first responders funding source, and that's the bottom one. So you can click on that. You'll receive this link within a couple of days, this PowerPoint, the whole thing. So just want to share that with you. And then the next slide is another resource page that we put together for you, which is the book, The Body Keeps the Score. Dr. Kamala Benner, who's Native, motivational interviewing guide that she put together, and some tribal risk assessments that were developed by tribal people, Native people. So with that, we're going to go on to the next slide. Just a reminder, every month, same time, same channel, you can find us here for your 1-hour session, which we develop for you. It's not for us, it's for you. It's your time out. Next month, for the next 2 months, actually, March and April, we're going to have a real treat of listening to the Boston Red Sox has a foundation. Yes, the baseball team. They do this incredible intensive clinical treatment for veterans, and they have a special Native veterans program. So part of them will be here next month. The full team will be here in April to talk about their Native treatment program, which does have a lot to do with escalation and de-escalation and sharing knowledge with Groya Native people. So you don't want to miss that. That's going to be really interesting. And now we're at the next slide. That's just a reminder. Go ahead.
Just to remind everybody, the follow-up, if you have any follow-up questions, just go ahead and email myself, Bernice Jordan at USET.org, or Devyani Bajpai at dbajpai@uset.org. And that's just to remind you, we have CEU credits offered for this month. So any questions around those, just go ahead and send us a message. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bernice. The next slide, our logo, and which we use as a transition. So the next one is the last slide for the day, which is our closing Native music. So if you can go to the next slide, Debiani. So real treat today. So today we wanted to share with you the an Osage song from the Osage Nation in Oklahoma that was developed, and they wrote it specifically to close the movie Killers of the Flower Moon. And it was written by an Osage Native man named George Scott. You'll see him in the video in a minute. He's got a red, a tuxedo with red lapels. George Scott is an Osage man. He lives in Hominy, Oklahoma, which is right down the road from where I was born and raised in Pawnee, Oklahoma. And it's really a very powerful song. The Osage people were incredible, fabulous people. And they wrote this song specifically for this movie. And the name of the song is Wazaji. And that is the Osage Native man for Osage people. The Osage Native language name for Osage people. It means Osage. But the great thing is that this song, which you're going to hear in a second, was nominated for an Academy Award for the best original song. And so you will, if you watch the Academy Awards on March 10th, the Osage people are going to be there, so hopefully we'll be able to see them. And their song, we would all hope that their song wins the Academy Award. So here's the Osage people singing the song.
Hey!
What a great song. Well, thank you all for joining us. And hope you tune in to the Academy Awards, I guess, and see if you see the Osage people there. And with that, I guess we'll close out. See you next month. Come back. Listen to us, listen to the folks talk about the intensive treatment for Native veterans. I think you'll enjoy it. So in the meantime, you know what we always say, have a brilliant day.